what modern medical research has shown us, in multiple studies that have been done over the past century, century and a half, is that our understanding of hallucinations is that there's something that goes on in the mind of an individual. It has no external reality. So they're like dreams. So I couldn't wake up my wife in the middle of the night and say, honey, I'm having this dream, I'm in Maui. Go back to sleep, join me in my dream, and let's have a free vacation. She couldn't join me in my dream, right? Why not? Because it's my dream. It's going on in my head, not hers. She can't join in with that. Another thing. Years ago when I lived in Virginia Beach, I had the privilege of getting to know a number of the Navy SEALs, because half the Navy SEALs are based out there. And so they were telling me about Hell Week. And that's something they've got to go through, like one of the first things they have to go through before they can become SEALs. Any former SEALs in here, or any current SEAls? Anybody? Good, I guess I can make up some stuff and nobody can correct me. But, so, they go through this, they start at Sunday night, they go all the way through around noon on Saturday, and they're just doing crazy stuff the whole time. I mean crazy stuff. If you want to read some about Hell Week, you can get a book by my friend Chad Williams called Seal for God. He's a former Navy SEAL, and he talks about Hell Week in there. And these guys are just amazing people. And they only get 3 to 5 hours of sleep the entire week while they're just running and swimming and doing all kinds of crazy stuff. High stress, intensity the whole week. Well, because of the sleep deprivation, probably around 80% of them experience hallucinations. And they see all kinds of things. And they tell me about those hallucinations, and some of them are just really funny what they thought they saw. But one thing is, they didn't see the same thing. They're all in the same frame of mind, but they didn't see the same thing. They were all having their own hallucinations, and by one person pointing out their hallucination, they didn't cause another person to see the same thing. Hallucinations are not contagious. They can't be, because they're in your head, right? They have no external reality. So hallucinations are not group occurrences. So you can have group delusions, which is different. You can have a group illusion, like an optical illusion, like when you think you see water on the road, you know, like that. Or a delusion is when you know something to be true, and yet you persist in the belief that it's not. Or you know something to be false, and yet you persist in the belief that it is. That's a delusion. And that doesn't work for this stuff. It would have to be a hallucination, but we see that's very unlikely because group hallucinations just can't occur. And then finally, you got Paul. Paul's not in a state of grief. He's not grieving over Jesus' death. He's glad he's dead. And now he's trying to destroy the church. Jesus would have been the last person in the world or the universe that Paul would have wanted to see or expected to see. So it just doesn't explain anything in terms of the hallucination hypothesis, even though it's the most popular alternative explanation for the resurrection. Historically speaking, it's one of the worst because it just cannot account for the data. That's my website. I'm also on Facebook, Twitter. There are some other ones as well. You know, if you want to bring them up, I can discuss them, but I want to stop talking and open it up for some questions here. So that's kind of it. I think it's a pretty simple case that you got to choose the best explanation because none of us can get in a time machine and go to the past and verify our conclusions. All we can do is look at the evidence and try to make the best rational decision here. So what have we discussed? We looked at there is a supernatural world. Supernatural events do occur. They occur today. They occur in our world. We talked about radically answered prayer. We talked about veridical apparitions. We talked about a zombie, right? Kind of thing. And we talked about near-death experiences. They received accurate information while dead they could not have known otherwise. So we see there is a supernatural element to reality. And then we looked at our sources, and we tried to take an objective look at those sources and not bend it more than the evidence could bear. And we saw we had a pretty good hand of sources. And when we looked at that, we could see that we could really trace back a few teachings with certainty of what the Jerusalem apostles were teaching. And then we looked and we said, just based on what we can know for those things, the best explanation would be that Jesus rose from the dead. It explains those facts. It explains them without forcing them to fit, or without any kind of ambiguity, or without any kind of speculation. And it's plausible within the scenario of a supernatural component to reality. So, based on that, I think the resurrection hypothesis, historically speaking, is the best one out there. And it doesn't just edge out its competitors. It beats them by a large margin. So, why is that important for us today? Well, for many of you who are students in here and you're really young, you might be thinking, I don't even know how that can apply to me at all today. I mean, gee, I'm 21 years old, I'm a junior, and I'm studying, and I got my whole life ahead of you. And, maybe you do. But if Christianity is true, if God exists, and we can have a relationship with Him, and He can be someone who guides you in your life, that you can pray, that He cares about you, He loves you, why wouldn't you want that? Why wouldn't you want a relationship with God? Especially if there is an eternity, if we have to answer to God afterward, and there's an eternity after this, and this is just going to be like one grain of sand on the seashore, our life, compared to all eternity, why wouldn't you want to get this right? So, there's really good reason, I think, that we should care about this. It guides us. We all have worldviews that really impact the way we live our lives. And this can provide a guiding light for us. All right, well, let me open it up for questions. And feel free to push back on anything I've said. I won't be offended, and I won't embarrass you.
All right, let's give Mike a hand. Just one reminder, remember, the best question gets that free book. I got it in the back, so it's up to you. If you don't figure it out, I'll try to help. But anyway, I'm sure you can handle it. All right, so come on up if you have any questions. Don't be shy. Actually, I have one question too.
Thank you so much, Dr. Licona, for coming to visit us. I really enjoyed your lecture. I just had a question on what are your thoughts on the Shroud of Turin and how authentic it is and how that could be used as a case for validating the claim that Jesus rose from the dead?
Good question. I haven't devoted a lot of attention or study to the Shroud myself, but I have read on it. I've read a couple of books on it, and I've talked to an expert on it, which is Gary Habermas, and he's written a couple of books on it. Co-authored with some guys who actually worked on the Shroud and talked to people who worked on it. And the Shroud of Turin is pretty interesting. They did, it's been around a long time, going back at least to the medieval ages. When they have, they talk about it, they even drew pictures of it being displayed publicly. So they know it's been around a long time. The general thought amongst a number of people was that it was a forgery. So in the late 1970s, I think it was 1978, they formed what was called the STIRP team, and I think that stood for Shroud of Turin Research Project. And they had all these scientists come in from all the prestigious scientists, and they figured they'd just get in, work on it for a week or two, and be able to prove that it was a forgery. But it was interesting. They found some really interesting things. It wasn't painted on there because, like on any garment, whether you're wearing a shirt, a sweater, or something, you'll have some fibers. Like if I were to look real carefully at the sweater, there would be fibers that this is made of. And you pull that fiber off and you see there are a whole lot of little fibers that are rolled up in that, right? Well, if you undid all of those and you came to that tiniest little fiber, you pull that, well, the image of the man that's on the Shroud of Turin only appears on that top little fiber, which shows that it wasn't painted on there or else it was seeped down into other fibers. They've also been able to show, and some professor at Duke showed that the image on it, using a NASA technology camera on it, the image on the Shroud of Turin is three-dimensional. It's also like a negative. So you guys wouldn't know this, you young ones in here, but back before there were digital cameras, we actually had filming cameras. Film. And you had to get it developed. And when you got it developed, you'd get this little strip, and they'd be called negatives. And so, like, if you took a picture of me and you looked at the negative, my face would be black, my sweater would be white. Everything was the opposite. And then when you, somehow, I don't know how it worked, but when you developed it, then everything turned out right. So the Shroud of Turin is like a negative. So that's really strange. They also showed like the nail prints weren't in the palms as you see in all the medieval paintings. They were in the wrists. And they've shown on cadavers that if you put the nail through the palm, it would tear through the skin. So that isn't going to work. Now I know in Mel Gibson's movie, The Passion of the Christ, and I love that. It's my favorite all-time movie. But one historical inaccuracy in there is they put it through that, and they tie that wrist to the cross. Well, of all the references to crucifixion that I've seen, and before that movie came out, I did a 6-month study on crucifixion in the process from all the primary sources in the ancient literature that I could find. It was really disturbing. I only found one reference to binding to the cross with ropes. Xenophon, 400 years before Christ, mentioned that they did that in Alexandria, Egypt. Otherwise, whenever the process is mentioned, it's nails. So it wouldn't work here, but it would work here. And in Greek, hand could be all the way from here, all the way up to the shoulder. So different from the word hand in English. This would work fine. Another thing on the shroud is you don't see the thumbs. You only see 4 fingers. And why? Because it's interesting. When they did this on cadavers and they put a nail through here, the thumb came in. This is pretty interesting stuff. Plus, they found that the way the body was, and through the 3-dimensional thing, the legs were bent, one foot was over the other, the shoulders slumped forward. He was in a state of rigor mortis. And rigor mortis only goes within a couple of hours after a person who dies a violent death to a maximum of 36 hours. And that's where the body returns to a stiff position that it was in when it died that violent death. And so that's, you kind of have that. But the hands were down here, they were tied, but if you were to let them go, they'd go back like this. They found post-mortem blood flow on it. They found pollen from plants in Jerusalem that only bloom in Jerusalem around April, the time of the crucifixion. They found limestone dirt on the bottom of the feet in the shroud that they can trace back to like caves or tombs in Jerusalem. Wouldn't have to be Jerusalem, but the kind of stuff that you do find in Jerusalem. So there's a bunch of things like that that seem to say that the shroud was authentic. So they kind of just close it up and say, well, we don't know what happened here. We can't disprove this, but it looks authentic. Some of the Sturb team scientists became Christians as a result. About 10 years later, they asked to do some carbon dating testing, carbon-14 testing on it. So the problem with carbon-14 testing, in order to do it, you've got to take some material off, and that gets destroyed in the process. So it's like, well, you want to destroy the thing to find out it's authentic? So it's, all right, well, where do we take off? Where do we take a patch off of it? And so they had this debate. Well, we want it off the part where the actual body is. No, we just want to take it off the tips of the edges. No, you don't want to get there. We want to get where the actual body is and stuff. And by the way, they found actual blood on it and body fluids that had dried. So they finally took a vote and they just took off the very end. And it dated it to, I think, either the 12 or 1300s. So they declared it was a forgery. But the guy who invented carbon-14 testing, I heard him say this myself, and he's an atheist. And he said, even though he trusts the dating, he said he had to admit that there would be a bunch of polymer from bacteria that had built up over the years since this was medieval. And that really technically should be cleaned off completely in order to get an accurate reading. And he said, even though he thought it was an accurate reading, there would be no way to prove it was an accurate reading. Then back in 2003, there was a biochemist who found a little bit of some of the material that was used in the shroud of the carbon-14. And they did some testing on that, chemical testing. And this guy he published it in a peer-reviewed journal, was able to show that this was not from the original shroud. It was not the same stuff of the main shroud. Well, was this deceptive stuff that went on? No. What happened was, back around, it was 1200 and something, there was a fire in the cathedral where they were holding this, and there were some scorches in the shroud. Well, a textile expert would have come back and did a weave to repair it, and that's what ended up being on the tip there. It wasn't part of the original shroud. So where they're at right now with the science in terms of the shroud, they're right back to where they were after the initial testing of the STIRP team. They don't know how the image got on there. So can we prove that this is Jesus' resurrection? No, not necessarily. One of the guys, Barry Schwartz, he was the photographer for the professional photographer for this STIRP team. He's not a Christian. He's Jewish, and he does not believe Jesus is the Messiah. But he believes that the shroud is authentic and Jesus rose from the dead. And he says he can't understand why Christians don't just embrace this. He says this just seems so obvious based on the evidence. So what's interesting, if the Shroud of Turin is authentic, we've actually got a photograph of the resurrection. So, a little about the shroud.
Hello. I apologize in advance, but being the only one in line, I guess it won't be bad if I take a second to formulate this. I guess I have two questions. I wish I had written them down so that they make sense. The first one is the question of the relationship between belief in the resurrection and someone's salvation. Because I kind of feel like in order to, I don't know, argue for the resurrection or to think it's worthwhile even to talk about the resurrection, you kind of have to have a belief that it's connected to someone's salvation. But as you said earlier, you have about maybe an 80% confidence that the resurrection happened. And I'm sure that the probabilities all over the room are all over the place for what people think about the resurrection and its likelihood. So we're all affecting those probabilities right now by thinking more about the theories and the evidence. But I guess the thing about salvation is that salvation is someone's relationship with God. And when I think about someone's relationship with God, I think about their desires. I think about their relationships to other people and whether or not they want to do good to them and whether or not they want to do good by God and worship Him and things like that. And I guess the question here is, how can an intellectual belief convince someone to have a desire? Like, if God's purpose is to save people, then what is the role of an intellectual belief in that? Because if it's 80% for you, but like 60% for you, does that mean that you have an 80% like more likelihood to suddenly start having a desire? That doesn't make any sense to me. It furthermore wouldn't make any sense for God to reward someone for gaining a desire that they gained through an intellectual belief, because that doesn't seem that you are actually having the desire. That seems to be that you're in a way compelled to have the desire by something that isn't authentic. So like, if I start living like Jesus because I have to, because my probability for thinking the resurrection happened got so high, then I don't understand why God would reward that. I think that what God would want, if He's trying to achieve salvation for His creatures, is to basically just affect their passions. So I guess, yeah, I don't understand the relationship between an intellectual conviction and one's redemptive standing with God. And then I guess I'll do the second question quickly, since the first one.
Let's do the first.
Let's go ahead and dig
All
into
right,
that.
so I don't claim to know God's mind on this, sorry, or his motives, but I think, have you ever, you're not married?
I am not.
Okay, so, I've been married, this April will be 29 years, and the book that's probably helped my marriage the most is one called The 5 Love Languages. And it talks about different ways in which we like to be loved, Some it's words of affirmation, some it's gift giving, quality time, physical affection, and what's the fifth one? Acts of service. Okay. So, you got these 5 primary ways that we like to be loved. Well, I think that there are also truth languages as well. So for me, my truth language is I want to reason this out. I want to know the facts. Some people, like I knew a medical doctor a few years ago, and she was seeking God, and so I was like, I'm into facts, I'm into evidence. So I was sharing all this stuff, and I thought she'd be thinking that along that way. And it's like, okay, well, I know it's reasonable, Mike, but I've just got to feel it. What? You need to feel it. You don't need to feel it. You just need to know it's true, because that kind of, it's just not my truth language. We all have different kinds of truth languages, and I think God can deal with us according to our own truth language. So, for me, look, I hope Islam is false, because really, when I look at Islam and when I read the early Islamic literature, like the Hadith and the early biography of Muhammad, I look at that and it's like, I don't like this religion. I don't like it. I don't like what I see of Muhammad. I don't like what I saw what he did and what he taught. I don't like it. I don't want it to be true. But if it were true, I'd want to follow it. If God was a despot, if he was just nasty, and if I didn't follow him, I'd be cast into hell forever, and I'd have to follow this God that I don't like. I'd follow him, because I don't want to be cast into hell forever. I'm just going to do the commandments and what he tells me. Why? Yeah, I guess I'm looking out for my own self-interest there. So I guess I just want to follow truth wherever it is and what's going to be in my best interest. But what I found as I've been a Christian now for many years is, he's pretty cool, and he loves me. And I've seen some really amazing answered prayer. There have been, a handful of times when I've just felt this intimacy with God that's just amazing. And you say, well, maybe you just brainwashed yourself. Well, maybe. But then when I see this really cool, radically answered prayer, and when I see all the evidence for the resurrection and things like that, I look and say, well, I've got good reason to believe that these were intimate times with God. So I don't know why God does certain things like that, and why he acts in some ways to some people and not toward others. It's a mystery to me, but I don't know that would negate the truth of anything. Does that make sense? If Jesus rose, he rose, even if we have unanswered questions.
Yes. I guess it's weird, because it's like, I feel like what you said is that ultimately it's just a matter of fact about history, that we are agnostics about events in the past. And if we're agnostics about events in the past, I guess I have to wonder...
Not agnostic,
agnostic is like, I don't know for sure that this thing is
we're
right.
agnostics about almost everything in that sense, aren't we?
Well, sure. That's the question. What is the relationship between intellectual beliefs, which are inherently agnostic, and a person's redemptive relationship with God?
But that's kind of where faith comes in, right? Because, I can be agnostic about a bunch of different things. But if I take a step forward, let's say I'm 51% of something, I might be, if I have to make a choice and I'm 51% convinced of something, well, I should move in that direction rather than the 49%.
Well, that's. I feel like we're getting at the point, which is like a person at 50% versus a person at like 55%. Like, they both need to do something besides adhere intellectually to something. They need to start, like, they need to make a passion, emotion, desire-based decision. And if that's the case, then why do we worry about the intellectual belief?
Well, because, well, I mean, I was brought up a Christian, in a Christian family. So I didn't want to just follow Christianity because that's the way I was brought up. I wanted to follow what was truth. And so I had to look at it intellectually in that sense. And again, I guess that's the way I'm wired. Some people, you could arrive at a truth from a non-intellectual way, but it could lead you to the, I don't want to commit the genetic fallacy here. I mean, you could get somewhere even for a wrong reason, but you can get to the right place for the wrong reason. Or it just might be a different reason. I just got there intellectually, and I guess what I'm trying to communicate tonight, there's some good intellectual reasons to believe the resurrection of Jesus. Yeah, the second one's quick, you said?
Yeah, the second one is quicker, and it's more of an objection, which is that this was based on the first one. If an intellectual conviction is a part of salvation, then I just feel like a possible argument against that, like it's not like a full-blooded argument, but a possible argument against that is that I feel like culture and language and time all inherently decrease a person's ability to arrive at a high, like the distance culturally, language-wise, and time-wise from the resurrection is inherently going to decrease its probability. Such that, I mean, if we think about a person in 10,000 years who's gone through like so many more language evolutions, and they're trying to understand what Jews meant in discussion with each other like 12,000 years ago.
Yeah.
Like, I just feel like my position is not just a little, it's significantly better than theirs. But I guess I feel like if you want to make the claim that an intellectual conviction is necessary for salvation, then it seems like the world is such that God has made a world where there will be a decreasing probability over time of people being saved. And that seems to be antithetical to the purposes of God.
I guess, well, in terms of the cultural distance, I do think that there's enough there. It's kind of like language. When we study language, how do we know that the Greek language in which the New Testament is written, how do we know the meaning behind those words? Well, because we can compare it with other texts out there, like Plutarch's Lives, the Moralia by Plutarch, or we can look at Cassius Dio and what he wrote in Greek. And sometimes you've got Greek translations of Latin text or vice versa. So when you do that, you can say, oh, well, we kind of know what this Latin word means, and yeah, they translate it into this in Greek. Oh, so that, and then we base it on these other texts, then this can read really coherently if it has this meaning. And, so we can get a pretty good idea of what the ancient language said. And by studying and understanding what the other language and the cultural stuff at that point, the Greco-Roman and Jewish literature of that period, I think we can get a pretty good idea, in most cases, what they meant when they were writing. Some cases not. We just have to say, well, I don't know. Like there's a verse when Jesus says, look, if you endure to the end, not a hair on your head will be harmed. And then in the very next verse he says, and some of you, they will take you into the synagogues and you'll be scourged and you'll be killed. Oh, well, wait a minute, you said my hair wouldn't be. So you say that they'll tear the skin off my body, they'll crucify me and behead me and all this kind of stuff, but it won't touch my nice hair. There's got to be some kind of an idiom that's involved in that has eluded us, and we don't understand what's necessarily being said, but I think we can understand most of what the language says. But that doesn't get to the heart of what I forgot what your ultimate, that was in like a two-part thing. What was the second part?
It was culturally,
Yeah.
language-wise,
Yeah.
and time-wise. Distance
Time-wise.
decreases.
Oh, that it would decrease. But we haven't found that. You said, well, you would think that this would happen, but that hasn't happened. Christianity is really growing today. Not so much in Western culture, but all around the world. It's amazing how quickly Christianity is growing, especially in countries where the church is persecuted the most. It's growing like crazy. They figure that right now in India, there's about 10,000 people converting to Christianity every week.